Article for St. Cycling Club magazine. What are we going to do? Context, character and narrative. And then perhaps plans for the future. And what might have gone wrong. What appeals about Audax? Why do we like Audax and Audaxing? How does it feel? How does it feel as a group of people? There you go, that'll do. So, context. I've, like many people, I'm a lifelong cyclist, but I wouldn't call myself a cycling enthusiast. And I didn't buy my first road bike until 2019, which was timely just before COVID. I bought an old Trek 2.3 Alpha, sight unseen, from an old army mate. His nickname was Big Mark Stickland, and he's a good 6'1", 6'2", bigger than me. And I knew if the bike was big enough for him, it'd be big enough for me. So bought it sight unseen, paid a whole £185 for it on Facebook, arranged on Facebook. May I just squeeze past there, do you think? Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, that Trek. Still got the Trek. It's hanging from the ceiling of my shed at the moment. I've, funnily enough, although it's possibly my oldest bike, I'm preserving it for use. So I've ridden much more modern, more expensive bikes through the winter, and I'm going to get back on that Trek in the spring. And I probably put 10 or 12,000 miles on that bike over the following 5 years, following 6 years through to 2015, and had some great trips away on it. I went to, well, I found myself during lockdown, my cycling journey. I started out with 5 miles and then 10 and 15 and 20 and 25, and built up slowly, bit by bit, and then got to the stage where I was cycling 25 miles fairly easily, and I set myself a challenge of cycling 25 miles a day, every day for 25 days. Not in a rush, just taking it easy. And after about 4 or 5 days, I felt quite tired, and after 10 days, still felt tired, but okay. And after 3 weeks, it just felt normal. And I think that helped a lot with a very basic level of fitness. And then started to pick up the mileage bit by bit. 50 miles and 60. A first run up to Leicester to go and see my mum, which felt like a massive expedition, and, you know, packed cheese sandwiches and fruit and chocolate to keep me going. And then basically just picked the mileage up bit by bit by bit. Rode down to Bristol from Cambridge to go and see the pal that I bought the bike from, which is a good 160 odd miles, and still is my longest ride for years and years. And then wanted to go a little further afield, so decided to ride to Geneva to see a pal of mine. And I packed the bike up, bought some luggage, jumped on the train down to London. I was going to cycle to Newhaven. Got as far as about 2 miles, 3 miles from the centre of London, and topped my first spoke. And fortunately, I was 1/4 of a mile from a local bike shop, and I went round to see this chap, and he fixed some spokes for me, no problem. And he said, "Where's your cycling kit?" because I think I was just wearing a pair of shorts. I said, I don't need cycling kit. And he said, you'll be sore? I said, I'll be fine. Anyway, it was during that time where you could travel in the UK, okay, and travel overseas. Well, you could travel within France, okay, but there were restrictions on travel, and you had to demonstrate you'd been vaccinated, this, that, and the other. I managed to get down to New Haven without popping any more spokes, although with my confidence a little dented, I should say. Got there, went to get on the ferry, New Haven to Dieppe, and the chap said, I'm not sure that we can let you cross because my vaccination certificate, I'd had my vaccinations at work in Baghdad, in Iraq, and while perfectly acceptable to UK National Health Service, and they were on my UK National Health Service record, the French, ultimately, to cut a long story short, the French didn't accept them. So I was unable to travel, which was probably, to be fair, a blessing in disguise. And I just went down and had because I'd taken all my camping kit, I had one night out camping, and because I felt I should more than anything else, and then got the train home. I cycled into London, cycled to the nearest train station, and then had one of those uber long train rides home that just take forever and forever. Anyway, that was my first attempt at long distance cycling, and not necessarily a fantastically successful experience, but definitely a learning experience. And I think most of the cycling that I've done, I could definitely put down to being, well, a learning experience. Excuse me. So, that was first attempt at Geneva. One of the things that I learned from that is get a decent set of wheels. So, given that I'd paid £185 for the bike, and you know, an expensive layout of cycling was buying a new helmet for £80 or something, I went to Strada and I bought a set of big fella wheels from Strada, which they say are good for the 110 kilogram gentleman or gentle lady. And I had a set of them, bought a set of them, and you know what, they have done me absolutely proud, because the following year I actually made good on my trip from London to Geneva, and it took me a while. I did the first leg. From home down to London, and then got the train home, and then just to get that in the bank, as you might say. And then shortly after that, set out one morning, jumped on the train down to London, cycled London, New Haven, jumped on the ferry to Dieppe, rolled off the ferry, and then cycled to Paris first with a stop along the way. And I don't know if you've ever been, but the Greenway, the Avenue Verte, the Green Road, is a British-French collaboration to open a green cycling route between our two capitals. And as one might imagine, the French side is really smart, really cool. Well, I haven't cycled all of it, but it is really cool. The bits I've cycled have been super. And the British side, well, it's the best of British cycling infrastructure, so as you can imagine, it's a bit shite, really. Probably can't say that, but anyway, the Avenue Verte on the British side is basically just a name given to existing cycle paths and cycle lanes. You definitely find yourself riding through housing estates, and no shame in that, but housing estates and churchyards, and car parks trying to pick your way along the route. I followed it out of London down to New Haven a little bit, but honestly, I also freestyled a bit. I used Google Maps to navigate a bit. I didn't use Strava because I didn't have that at the time, but Google Maps and one of the other navigation programs for cycling things, Komoot. I think Komoot. So eventually got to New Haven, which is a fair schlep because although it's only 60 miles, you're going over the South Downs. And as I've done it a few times now, invariably it's the first day of your tour, and so you are loaded to the hilt with all your food and gubbins and whatever. So it's a fair schlep getting up and down the hills. But made it to New Haven. Favourite pub just down the road from the port. A few beers in there. And then onto the ferry as a foot passenger. As I was locking my bicycle up, there was a lady with a rally chopper, and I thought she must be a commuter, going backwards and forwards and just, dogging a couple of miles either side on her rally. But we locked our bikes up together. It turns out she was going on a touring holiday, and on a rally chopper with all of her kit in a big backpack. And I said, come on, let's go and have a drink. You sound interesting. And so it proved. Her name was Vicky Knox, Victoria Knox, Dr. Victoria Knox. And with a speciality in terrorism, particularly also the criminal gangs of Central America and migration. She's a lecturer, author, consultant, and I was just a simple security guy, but her field of expertise and my area of interest definitely overlap. So we had more beer than we should before we went our separate ways, and I didn't take her details, didn't want to be intrusive, but we did cycle off the ferry together the next morning. I went and had a kip on the floor of the ferry, which I find easy enough to do. You sleep anywhere if you're tired. And then bumped into her the next morning. We cycled off the ferry, and I grabbed a picture of her with her rally chopper. Oh, what else was of interest coming off the ferry? There'd been a guy rather snootily looking down his nose at my rig, my old checkpoint, and my big touring sacks and stuff, my mix of, I suppose, almost commuter style touring kit and more modern, recently bought Rothley, if that's how you pronounce it, luggage. Rather look down his nose at all my gear. He was lightweight bike packing, but when we came off the ferry, he was static because he'd broken his chain, and he was waiting for the bike shop to open. I did say, mate, I've got a spare link and I can fit it for you, and he waved me away. He said, okay, start your day is delayed by 4 or 5 hours then, so be it. Anyway, rolled out of the ferry port with Vicky, looking for the start of the green route, the Avenue Verte, and she went off on her own merry way. I gave her a farewell wave. I did thought I'll try and catch up with you another time, because she was interesting. And much later, after my trip, I jumped onto a Facebook group for rally choppers, and so I met this lady on the ferry on this bike. Anybody know her? And there was, yes, that's Vicky. So rather wonderfully, through the power of social media, I was able to connect with her. And lots of things have flown from that. A connection with some Afghan refugees who I've hosted and looked after, and this, that and the other. Anyway, we're here to talk about cycling. So back to cycling. That first London-Geneva trip took a total of 8 days. And I can't now from memory remember if it was 8 days from home and including my separately run sort of home to London day, or if it was 8 days from London to Geneva, forget. But by the by, the route took me from New Haven to Dieppe to Paris, with a stop at a small campsite about 20 miles outside of Paris, 20-30 miles outside of Paris. And at this stage I'd diverted from the Avenue Verte, because the Avenue Verte is a sort of a 5-day trip designed to be a holiday in and of itself, and really I was looking to get to Geneva as quickly as I could. So the Avenue Verte meanders and wanders and takes a fairly circuitous route, and when it started to meander and wander, I decided to cut directly across country. So that's what I did, and ended up on a little campsite. I didn't have a tent, I was just I just had a bivouacking. So I was in my sleeping bag with a bivy bag on a roll mat, which was fine. Directed by the lady who ran the campsite to head to a patch of grass under a tree, and there's another cyclist there who also camping. He'd set up tent, and I suggested we go for a beer. So we went in the local village, found a local tobacco, and sat outside with the locals drinking far too much. He was a very nice guy, retired engineer, spending his life cycle travelling, which I guess is inexpensive, and I think he was going off to see his kids, cycling off to see his kids and stuff. There may be something for my future. Woke up next morning early with the birds and away, and headed into Paris. In Paris, I was amazed at the absence of traffic. It was just super easy getting in. Right, nobody around, very little traffic until I got almost to the centre. I did have a bit of an issue in that I didn't have a Garmin head or a Wahoo or any navigation aid. I did have a little quad lock and a mount for my phone, which I had on my bars and I was using to navigate with the phone. But two issues with that. First of all, the phone just eats battery power. So, or rather the phone when you're using navigation eats battery power. And secondly, I didn't have data while I was away. Now I know that if I'd sent an SMS to whatever it is, 123 or the Vodafone number, and said EU data every day for I think £9 a day or something, which is okay, I'd have had data to run my sat nav, but I didn't know that, so I didn't do that. So I was dobbing from one McDonald's to another where I could get free Wi-Fi and stay in touch with Wi-Fi and download the data I needed for that bit of mapping, because I mean there is a map system you can use, forget what it's called now, I might look it up later, where you can download a map onto your phone, and so it has the mapping, and then GPS doesn't take data, it takes GPS signals, so you are able to nav with it. I was using that a bit. Anyway, So I found a McDonald's which was shut. So bloody hell, I was looking forward to breakfast. Then found a little boulangerie and had a wonderful croissant, pain au chocolat, coffee, and carried on my trip into Paris, which was still remarkably quiet. And then all became clear. It was, of course, Bastille Day. So while there was no traffic on the outskirts of town, the centre was absolutely rammed. And I'd arranged to meet a friend for lunch, having swept by the Eiffel Tower just to get the photograph, because we all need the photograph if we're going to Paris. But I found it difficult to cross the Seine, or is it the Loire? I think it's the Seine. I found it difficult to cross the river because all the bridges were closed off because of the parades and security and so on. On the upside, I did get to see the French Foreign Legion doing their world famous slow march through the centre of Paris, and wonderfully impressed by the depth and breadth of their ethnicities and their age groups. That's the closest I ever got to the French Foreign Legion. I did try to join when I was 17. I hitchhiked down to the Fort de Nogent, which is where Simon Murray had tried to join the French Foreign Legion, as set out in his... In fact, no, Fort de Versailles is where Simon Murray, in his book Legionnaire, had joined the Legion in the 60s. So I went there, and when I got there, I was turned away. I think it'd been turned into a military museum or something. And I was given directions to the Fort de Nogent, which is where I went. I remember walking down the road leading up to the fort with a classic sort of twin towers either side of a massive gate, a little peephole opening up intermittently as I approached the gate. And when I got there, a chap with a big machine gun on his chest opened the gate and said, "Yes." And I said, "I've come to join the Foreign Legion." And he pointed me to a waiting room, and I sat and waited. I was then taken to change and whipped around with half a dozen other young men to various appointments before finally I was rejected and pushed back out the door because my eyesight wasn't up to the game. And that's fine. I did other things instead, although obviously a little disappointed. So that was my previous run-in with the Legion. And I had to come home disconsolate. Finally, I managed to cross back to the cycling. Finally, I managed to cross the river and met up with my pal for lunch. My pal's a friend of a friend of somebody I worked with in Afghanistan. She was working at the Gare du Nord for British Passport Control. She's also plucky in her way. She's in the Long Distance Walking Association. And man, those guys are absolutely nuts. Crazy, the distances they do. I suppose Long Distance Walking Association is the walking equivalent of Audax. They just go a very long way, albeit quite sedately. But if you're doing 150 miles on foot, you can go at whatever pace you like. So I had lunch with her and then kicked off again. I went to go and get my photograph. I couldn't leave Paris without getting my photograph of me, my bike, and the Eiffel Tower. Couldn't get that close to it, but it was fine. It was definitely there. And definitely me and definitely the Eiffel Tower. Then worked my way through southern Paris, navigating really badly, stopping regularly to check my map, and it not making much difference. At one point ending up on a dual carriageway and then a motorway, thinking, you're in a bad place now. Managed to escape that. Finally got onto a decent cycleway out of Paris and cycled and cycled and cycled. And I had a campsite marked on my map that I was heading towards. and often these places shut at 8 o'clock at night. So, you know, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock and you're done. And they lock the gates and that's you can't get on. So I pushed hard to get to this place. And I was intermittently sort of on the road, but the roads can be a bit hairy. And then following a cycle path, but then the cycle path was sort of that washboardy, rutted mud. Even though it was dry, wasn't great, and I was nervous. It was my first experience, first time out with the new wheels from Strada, so I didn't know what they'd stand, and time was kind of getting short, getting closer to 8 o'clock. So I stopped, did a bit of a map check, and then decided to jump on the road, and then sped along, pushing the pedals around at some fair liquor and not fair pace, and finally arrived at the campsite at about 5 to 8 to find it was just a car park in the woods with a sign that I think said, "Take away your rubbish."